Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here in person. Thank you for those joining us online through the live streams, which I think has not started because one camera is looking here, the other is looking at the wall. But anyway, thank you all for being with us. Anticipatory briefings are interactive series of academic-led talks where basically we bring topics from the GESDA Breakthrough Radar to life. And we try to showcase the latest science and ask someone to tell us their outlook for the next 5, 10, and 25 years. The format is 15 minutes talks followed by 15 minutes Q&A. Although we're a bit late, we're going to finish 5 minutes later, so we'll keep that format. And by the way, as this is the last session, I was asked to remind you that at the end of the session, there's a QR code, and if you could just scan it and give your feedback on these sessions, it would be well appreciated. Our next speaker holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Chicago. Then he went on to study at the prestigious MIT, stayed on the East Coast. And then he went to Yale, USC, and Brown. He's a professor honoraire at the Geneva Graduate Institute and also a public policy fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. He authored or edited 11 books, which is 11 more than I wrote. And his research focuses on international relations theory, multilateral global governance, and international sanctions. In this session, he will talk about how future global relations are being shaped by the shifting balance of power and the rise of informal international organization, elements that will influence global diplomacy in the next 5, 10, and 25 years. Please help me welcome Thomas Biersteker.
All right, thank you very much for that introduction. I'd like to thank GESDA for the invitation to speak on this topic. I must say, however, it's rather daunting or rather presumptuous to be able to talk about the future of international relations. It's rather humbling to try to think about what to say about this topic, especially over a long period of time. And yesterday I had a conversation with one of my former MA thesis advisees. Some of you may know Jonas Pasquier from the Swiss Foreign Ministry, who said it would be nice if we could anticipate the next 25 days. Let alone the next 25 years with regard to international relations. So I'll try to be modest about what I think I can say. I'll try to reflect a bit on some global trends as I see them. And then at the end, I'll try to make a recommendation more relevant to the summit, which is to think about how we might want to broaden our conception of science in the social sciences when we think about international relations. And so you can see I've already retitled, I'm not talking about the future of international relations, but talking about from international to global relations amongst multiple world orders. And the concluding part is really I'm going to try to make the case for using dialectical thinking to navigate the informal governance and challenges of complex multipolarity in the world that we're in and emerging into. So first of all, with regard to context, I'm following the structure of all these other types of anticipatory briefings, context, 5 years, 15 and 25 years. Obviously, you don't need me to tell you that we're facing extraordinarily complex challenges and profound uncertainties in contemporary world affairs. Think of the ongoing wars in Ukraine, Gaza, Lebanon, the often forgotten ongoing war in Sudan, and other parts of the globe. Think about the economic uncertainty of growing debt. Think about the problems of increased neo-mercantilist competition and protectionism globally. And I don't need to remind anyone about the significance of global climate change and the consequences for the magnitude and uncertainties associated with major storms, flooding in some parts of the world, droughts in others. So we're facing complex challenges, profound uncertainties in contemporary world affairs. And some have called this a polycrisis, where you have multiple simultaneous crises that are actually interacting with each other and making them worse. I can just give a simple example of how the Russian invasion of Ukraine triggered extraordinary, in some ways extraordinary, G7 plus sanctions applied against Russia. The sanctions include something brought back from the Cold War, which are export controls. We see export controls on semiconductor exports to Russia during as one of the sanctions, one part of the sanctions package. These export controls are designed initially for political purposes, to degrade Russia's capacity to engage in the military invasion of Ukraine. But we're seeing them morphing into economic policy more generally, where export controls on semiconductors are being part of a new, almost some call it weaponized interdependence, where in fact protectionism is increasing, semiconductors it's morphed from a political purpose to a larger economic strategic purpose. This division, we're seeing a fragmentation of global supply chains, and this fragmentation and growing protectionism has other implications, because we've seen that, now let's link it to global climate change and the implications of putting very large tariffs, both from North America and also from Europe, on the Chinese export of electric vehicles. So we start with the political crisis, we go to economic crises and expansion, and then we see how it has implications for, because in my view, this kind of protectionism on electric vehicles will have implications for the ability of Europe and North America to actually meet global climate change goals and standards. So we see an interaction of global crises, and as global climate change deepens, we're going to see more conflicts associated with it. So we go from conflict to economic policy to environmental. At the same time, we have a contestation of global norms. Now, global norms are always contested, they're always performed, reperformed. But we're seeing now a major contestation. The Russian invasion violates fundamental principles of the UN Charter. The whole idea of resolution of conflicts through means other than armed force. The idea of annexation, not only territorial invasion, but annexation of territory and erasing the identity of a country. These are profound challenges to what we thought were fairly well-established norms following the Second World War. We can look at the contestation of norms in other issue domains. Again, the growing protectionism is challenging the so-called liberal international rules-based order with regard to international trade. Or look at the violations of human rights norms in contemporary Afghanistan. So we can see that we're in a world of not only a polycrisis, but profound contestation of what we thought perhaps were somewhat stabilized norms about behavior. And I'm going to talk about two displacements that I see in contemporary world politics. The first is informal governance is displacing traditional international organizations. And I just published a book this past June called Informal Governance in World Politics with Ken Abbott. It's an edited volume where we're looking at, and I'll say some things about that in a few moments, but that's the first displacement I want to talk about. The second displacement, however, is this displacement of the Eurocentric world order as we know it by a multipolar world order. That's informed by the fact that I just returned from China a week ago and had some very interesting discussions about the meaning of and future of global governance with our Chinese colleagues. So what I'm going to do is talk about, I've already mentioned the complex challenges, I've mentioned informal governance, multipolarity, the world we're entering. Then I'm going to make a case for what I call global international relations. I'll say what I mean by that, and then conclude with an argument that we need to expand our conception of science beyond analytical, empirical, positivist-based approaches to science and the social sciences to more open-ended dialectical thinking. So, the next 5 years, where are we going? Well, I said informal governance. So this is the chart that basically begins our first chapter in the book, Informal Governance in World Politics. And I just want to point out the bright yellow line is what we usually talk about and think about when we study international organizations. These are formal, intergovernmental, treaty-based organizations, or what we call FIGOs. This is most of the subject of global governance courses. Most courses on international organizations focus precisely on international organizations. Many of you have long years of experience and have worked in international organizations. Much of what we're surrounded by, and when I teach at the Graduate Institute, and I can point to the WTO this direction, the WHO this direction, UNHCR across the street, these are formal, intergovernmental, treaty-based organizations. They're profoundly important in global governance, but they're increasingly in a crowded space. And they're being challenged in important ways by what we call informal intergovernmental organizations. Can I point to this? I'll stay here. You can see that the light yellow line at the bottom. From let me make the first main point, about FIGOs. What's really significant about them is that you can see that until the 1990s, there was a steady growth, particularly since 1945. That's what you would predict and expect with international organizations. But the total number, the cumulative total number of formal intergovernmental organizations has stalled. They're not being created any longer. It's a phenomenon of the 1990s. Some organizations are disappearing, not very many, because institutions are sticky. But we're seeing very few, a couple of new institutions being created, the two AIIB and NDBA in China. But for the most part, formal intergovernmental organizations have stalled. We see a steady rise, somewhat linear, at the very bottom line from 1975 forward, of what we call IGOs, or informal intergovernmental organizations. Now, these refer to the G7, the G20, the BRICS group, the expanded BRICS group, friends groups, like-minded states groups that are increasingly playing important roles in global governance. And then the exponential increase, that's a line referring to trans-governmental initiatives. These are public-private initiatives, multi-stakeholder initiatives, partnerships of various forms that are increasingly providing important examples of governance, from the Kimberley process, the EITI, the ICOCA. I could go on with the whole alphabet list of these kinds of initiatives. Oftentimes, and these are initiatives that involve public sector enterprises, public sector, international organizations, governments, but also private sector firms. And in addition to private sector firms, oftentimes NGOs. So you have a mix of different actors who are participating in the governance of an increasingly significant number of domains. And a lot of this is driven by advances in technology, precisely the kinds of discussions we've been having the last 2 days here at the GESDA summit. So we see that oftentimes they have to be in the room because you can't answer some of the questions about how they're governed without that kind of expertise being represented. So this is the first displacement. IGOs and TGIs are displacing formal intergovernmental organizations. I mentioned that many of us still focus on FIGOs. I'm not saying that what's going on in formal international organizations of the UN are irrelevant by any means, but we see the rise of informal governance and what I describe and others have described as a fundamental competition for authority. And this competition is taking place in this institutional mix with different types of actors that are increasingly playing roles in governance. In the book, we talk about 3 different types of informality. We organized the book around 3 types. The first I've already described in detail, informality in institutional form. The second type, however, is reliance on informal practices within organizations. And everything from who gets appointed to who appoints the director general of the organization, to questions about what are the institutional cultural routines that are operating within the organizations. And third, we talked about informal policy networks that operate around institutions. These are oftentimes comprised of people that share a common expertise on a topic, sometimes quite esoteric expertise. And they may come from governments, they may come from international organizations, they may come from the private sector, they may come from NGOs, and they may come from academia. So some of us, actually, and there's reference briefly to my work on sanctions, I participate in a transnational policy network of people focusing on sanctions, sanctions reform, sanctions applications, sanctions redesign, and so on. So these are the 3 different types of informality that we discuss in our recent book. That's for the foreseeable future. This is the world, the complex world of contemporary governance. Over the next 10 years, the second displacement, as I mentioned already, is the multipolar world is displacing the Eurocentric world. And this is happening gradually, incrementally, day by day. We can see evidence of it. It's not as if other countries or other regions of the world are trying to entirely replace, but they're certainly very interested in reforming the existing institutional structures. And there's a normative contestation over how the world should be governed. Oftentimes this is focused on, is there enough access, is there enough participation, is there real participation of emerging actors and powers around the world? And in some of my more abstract theoretical work, I've been talking about the need for an ontological shift in our thinking. And by that I mean, I think we should move away from a focus on states and perhaps civilizations to the idea of world orders. Now, what I mean by that is a complex of ideas about how the world is governed and how normatively it should be governed. And that is based on the idea that we don't live in a realm of a single world order. We often talk about the liberal, rules-based international order after the Second World War. But that wasn't universal by any means. Almost half the globe was not really included in that world order for the most part. But in fact, we had contested world orders under the socialist world and the liberal capitalist world. And that's the norm. It's not the exception. We oftentimes force ourselves into a single periodization, trying to say, well, that was this period, and then we had the post-Cold War period, and then we have the post-September 11 period. Those are rather misleading because they make assumptions about universal application. And I think the way we need to think about world order is not in the unitary, in the singular, but in the plural. We live in a world of contested, interpenetrated conceptions of how the world is and normatively should be governed. This then leads me to my next, and this is something I've been doing within the institution of the International Studies Association. I've recently just stepped down as chair of the Global IR section of the International Studies Association. And what we mean by global IR is a shift in thinking, a shift in attitude, a way of thinking about the world and the world's problems. And it's fundamentally based on multi-perspectivism, that we need to make the effort. We need to make a serious effort, an empathetic effort, not just to understand how the other thinks in order to respond or control, but to understand how they feel about the world, why they feel this way about the world. If we're looking at conflicts, if we're looking at Russia, Ukraine, we need to look at Russia's arguments. It doesn't mean that they're equally valid or that they're legitimate, but we need to try to understand what motivated Russia. Similarly with Hamas and Israel, we need to understand, empathetically, multi-perspectivism needs to drive the way we think about the subject. And this means self-reflection from multiple vantage points around the world. We need to be able to incorporate these differences of understanding different histories, different interpretations, even different definitions of core concepts. And we need to try to transcend parochialism. I spent most of my career teaching in the United States. We oftentimes, in teaching international relations, would talk about contemporary global problems. But I observed there, and certainly even more so since moving to Switzerland in 2007, that we need to make an effort to transcend parochialism, because most of the discussions, theoretical debates and discussions within the US, when I was teaching there, were not about global problems, but about US problems in the world. And it was simply this projection onto the other. Now, it's easy to say the US is parochial. I can assure you from some analysis I've done of syllabi in French institutions, Swiss institutions, other institutions around the world, the US is not the only parochial location. There are other kinds of parochialism. But we made to make this effort to try to transcend these parochialisms. And ultimately, rather than dealing with incommensurable national histories, our goal should be try to write in common a world history that takes incommensurable differences into consideration. It doesn't mean you can average everything out, but it does mean you make the effort empathetically to go. And this is the basis of global IR. Next 25 years, I have to ask Laurent a question. This is current? The timing here is current?
Yes.
Okay. I'll pick up.
Red, right?
No. Oh, it just did. Yes, I just went below a minute. Thanks. It's the first time I've done one of these. Next 25 years. Okay, well, this is, what can we say? I said we need to broaden our conception and thinking. We need to fundamentally go beyond an approach to social science of international relations. It goes beyond a positivist, empirical, quantitative focus on causal explanation. Not to say that that's not an important effort, the effort to try to divine universal truths about things, but we need to go beyond that to try to get to a deeper understanding of our subject. Because a lot of the causal explanations, many people within my field and domain would argue that this is the only way to do science in international relations. And I would argue, no, these are Newtonian-inspired causal explanations, but they're not the only scientific way to analyze global IR. So we need to employ what I call an open-ended, non-deterministic dialectical approaches to some extent. And I'll conclude with just a few quick notes about affinities between quantum theory and open-ended dialectics. I don't have time to describe it. I have a whole 15-week course at the Graduate Institute on dialectics of world orders. I'm not going to do that now. But the affinities are interesting. A few years ago, when I was teaching at Brown, I co-taught Introduction to Physics. Now, you may wonder why, but that's asking the Q&A, and I'll explain why. I was co-teaching with Leon Cooper. Leon Cooper won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1972 for his work on superconductivity. And I was giving a lecture in the course about different approaches in the social sciences, contrasting analytical, empirical, behavioral science with dialectical, modern, open-ended synthetic dialectics. Had a big matrix on the board. And at the end, the first question came from Leon, and he said, why do people call what you call scientific, scientific? He said, that's positively Newtonian. Your modern open-ended synthetic is much closer to quantum. And I recently contributed a chapter in a book. There is a book called Quantum IR, believe it or not, edited by James Derry and Alexander Wendt. I have a chapter in it called Quantum Pedagogy. I won't have time to go into it, but let me make a few associations. The idea, entanglement. The idea of entanglement is very similar to the core idea within dialectical analysis that everything is interrelated with everything else. That in fact, everything is connected in different ways. The subject-object distinctions are increasingly difficult. The uncertainty principle, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, the idea that measurement influences the object of study. Well, we as social scientists, we participate in our subject, especially if we participate in transnational policy networks. We influence the subject that we study, and therefore we need to examine the knowledge interest in the context of research. Superposition. The idea that we should avoid forcing complex analyses and explanations into a single explanation. So oftentimes when I'm teaching balance of power theory, if I look at late 19th century and I'll say, okay, you can explain that through balance of power, but you can also explain it through imperialism. You don't need to choose between them, and that's where complementarity comes in. Basically, you need to say that you can be both pursuing the balance of power and being imperialistic at the same time. There's not a contradiction here at all, but if you take a multi-perspectivist approach, you have deeper understanding. Outlook, I'll conclude on a positive note. I started off on a pretty negative note about the nature of the world today. I'll conclude with something I often say at the end of my courses, which is, it's a world of our making. This is actually a title of a book by a friend of mine, Nicholas Onoff, who titled a book on rules in international relations. And I want to say we need to move beyond deterministic laws to say war is inevitable. Wars have always happened. Wars will always happen. The recent work by Graham Allison, the Thucydides trap, war between the US and China is inevitable. John Mearsheimer's work, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. Well, it doesn't have to end in tragedy. It's a world of our making. What we do, what we say, and what we don't do and don't say are part of the world that we live in. And I'll conclude on that note. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Thomas. So we will know how much time we are given for Q&A when this goes from red to green. Oh, 10 minutes.
Ooh,
thank you very much.
I went over 5 minutes.
So if you have questions, raise your hand. I see multiple. You know what? We're going to go down, up. We're going to 1, 2, 3, 4, if it's fine.
I'll take notes on this one.
Let's go here. I learned a new word, parochialism. I never heard of it.
No.
So I went to look into the dictionary, and it means narrow-mindedness and localism, apparently, for those who might not know it, like me. Sir, your question, please.
Sure. Gregory Tutton with the Diplomatic Corps of the Order of Malta. I spend a lot of time at the UN Palais.
Okay.
So I have 2 simple questions. The simplest one is, how? And then the second question is, in the light of a global IR, if we take it as a quantum system, how do we start that process? I mean, if the UN is in the box, is it dead or is it alive? If we look at it,
Schrödinger's cat. Right,
do we look at it and look at each other in the Rights Council or at ITU or at WIPO, and then how do we collapse the wave of getting towards what you're describing as a world's order in the light of the challenges we face each day, at the UN at least?
So if I understand well, inside a formal organization, you can still have informal. All you have to put is like some Swiss white wine or liquors, and then a formal organization becomes informal.
Could we take a formal structure and informalize it and collapse an informal wave, and then get to these world orders about which you're positing?
Okay.
Thanks.
Take a few questions at first, okay.
So I think there are a few people who are quite keen to hear your answer, apparently.
Want me to do it
we
first?
also have a few UN people. We're going to give you the microphone and just hold on a second. And you want to answer now, Thomas?
How? Well, as I said, I think one needs to begin with the thinking and the attitude and approaches to it at the outset. Now, of course, people are in fixed roles, particularly in formal international organizations. That's where I think I'm not making a choice between formal and informal. In fact, oftentimes the formal use the informal, and the informal are ways of doing things that you can't do in the formal session. So in that sense, I think they can be complementary in some ways. It's not a matter of saying that. What I really wanted to identify at the outset is the complex world that we're in. And in the beginning, we try to talk about why that is emerging. There are a number of reasons. It's everything from, we can go through traditional explanations of power, but we can also look at, to some extent, declining powers want venues where they're less constrained. That's the more cynical way of thinking about it. So there are plenty of problems in getting there. But I think it ultimately is an attitudinal change. That's how I would describe it. And that's why I think those of us in teaching and pedagogy need to try to instill within our students this way of thinking about the world by saying, don't just, I know you're paid for by this country, you're representing this country, but if you want to be effective, you really need to make the effort, often through informal channels, to engage the others in a way that you understand where they're coming from, literally, in that sense. It's not a great answer, but it's a partial answer to a good question. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. I'm François Rivasso, former ambassador here, and I'm a member of CSIS, and like you, I had the experience of teaching in the US a number of times. My point is the following one. I like very much your approach, but I've been a bit frustrated. Don't you think that many approaches, almost every approach today, point out towards a certain trend towards polarization of international society in 5, maybe even till 10 years? And that during this period there is a kind of growing gap that I perceive between what would be the desirable, what you have perfectly described in my view, and what would be a more realistic approach where states are trying to recover a bit a part of the sovereignty and power and influence that they had not felt necessary to exercise in the 10 or 20 years, at least in Europe and in the US. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Just behind you for the next question. Sorry, we have too many. We're going to have to make some choices.
Okay.
Thomas.
Thank you. Gary Jacobs.
Sorry, we're going to answer this.
Do you want to take each question, or should we just take a bunch?
I think we go one by one because we have to be mindful of time. There's already like 20 hands, so we're not going to be able to.
Okay, but then I have to give superficial answers.
Yeah,
but
sorry, just one
no.
second.
Well, your point about trends toward polarization, yes, it's a very, very important subject, and one of, I think one can not solve that easily or quickly, but one can get a different insight into it by looking at polarization over, I said earlier about world orders, how the world is and normatively should be ordered. And I think a lot of the polarization is actually precisely around those kinds of questions. And so it's not a matter of, that's why I say, let's move from states to the concept of world orders. What I mean by that is that these world order ideas, like illiberal democracy, it's not just a Viktor Orban thing or a Vladimir Putin thing, it's a Donald Trump thing. In that sense, these ideas are interpenetrated. Just like radical Islamist transnationalism is not just something that happens from Gaza or from southern Lebanon, it's something that happens everywhere. So we need to rethink about this contestation and the kind of polarizations that exist already, and that these are, in fact, oftentimes, in my view, manifested in different, simultaneously coexisting, incommensurable understandings of the world. That's a big challenge, not easily dealt with, but that's the way I would analytically link the idea of world orders to your question. Thanks.
Gary Jacobs from World Academy of Art and Science. Thank you for a wonderful analysis. Of all the factors you have discussed, the trends you have discussed, or something other, do you sense anything as the most fundamental root cause that's manifesting through these changes? Or do you see anything at a deeper level that hasn't just been described by phenomenon?
I'm hesitant to respond only because I'm not an essentialist, but a radically contextualist. So I don't like to try to say this is the essence of, this is the single driving force. So in that sense, I would be reluctant to try to put my finger and say, that's it. That's oftentimes what happens when we have these monocausal explanations and this unitary understanding of how to think about things. It's all power. or it's all material economic interests and so on. So I don't like to reduce the world to those kinds of considerations. I actually think we live in a far more diverse complex where under different, now when I say context, I mean where we are in the world, what's happening in the world, shared events in the world, which I think profoundly shape our understandings and thinking. Even the intertextual analysis of who we cite, who we quote, who we're responding to, I made a few dismissals of two American colleagues, Graham Allison and John Mearsheimer, in terms of identifying my differences with them and the inevitable world they see. That's why I concluded with the optimistic outlook. It's a world of our making. So I try not to be deterministic in thinking about this. Not that it couldn't turn out really badly. I'm not saying that, but I'm not being, in that sense, that utopian about it. But I do think that we actually live in a world which we can shape and participate in, and that's the way to think about it, rather than saying what's the root cause. So.
Over here. Right. Hello, sir. My name is Giulio. I'm here on behalf of the Villar Institute. I'm 16 years old. And I just wanted to shift the conversation a little bit. As youngsters, we're looking into this world. We're blasted with social media or just media in general that's, of course, biased. So in order to be able to, well, when you said at the beginning, think of all the crises, we have to have correct information. And obviously with that, then find solutions. So what would be your advice to young people today on where to look for correct information?
Well, I would say go to multiple sources. Don't go to a single source, and go to sources that are, to some extent, have a reputation. I wouldn't derive my news and information from the internet alone. I would go to certain kinds of sources, but I would also encourage very much. In fact, I gave a lunch seminar at the Graduate Institute today, where I was talking to first and second year students about things, and I said, in the future, it's important that you are capable of engaging with multiple perspectives, because that's the world that you're entering. And therefore be open to, listen to your friends, listen to your colleagues, to make the effort to try to understand where they're coming from in the world. I think that's actually the main advice I would give is to adopt this sort of multi-perspective, this global perspective, rather than trying to force a single explanation on a very complex reality.
We have to get to very short questions, please, because time is running out.
Okay. I'll get some water.
Madame, you're next. We have an issue with the microphone. Can we? Don't touch. Normally, it's coming on.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Delia Mammon. I'm a founder and president of an NGO that is at the nexus of education, peace, and violence prevention. And we do this work from the age of 4 all the way up. And so my question to you is, you must have some dreams regarding education. What are they?
Usually they're nightmares about faculty meetings and curriculum reform, but no. Well, I don't have, I'm not sure I have an answer to that question. It's hard to say. I mean, I guess the idea that, actually one of the nice things about living in Geneva is that it is so profoundly, I often describe it as a research laboratory for understanding the world, all the different, and even in the classroom here, our students come from all over the world, which gives us this kind of deparochialized environment in some ways that's very enriching. So I would say I would hope that these kinds of environments are not so unique and actually could be expanded in many other ways, where you have these kinds of exchanges where you don't categorize people based on how they look, their race, their gender, their nationality, but in fact having places where you could actually interact with each other in a mutually respectful way. One point about that, of course, there's a lot of work and discussion in higher education about safe spaces. Since I'm a graduate of the University of Chicago, I don't believe in safe spaces. I don't think a classroom should be a safe place. I think a classroom is where people should be challenged and provoked and to be uncomfortable, not be comfortable. But that's a different whole set of issues on higher education, not the primary work that you're doing.
Thank you very much. That was Thomas Biersteker. Thank you for a big round of applause for our last speaker.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks, moderator. Thank you.
Have a great evening. Thanks. Sorry for all the questions we couldn't take.